Director Comey, are you aware that Roger Stone played a role in the Trump campaign?
I'm not going to talk about any particular person here today, Mr. Shiff.
I'm going to continue to ask these questions because, among other things, I want to make sure you are aware of these facts, whether you're able to comment on them or not. Have you read press reports where Mr. Stone proudly boasts of engaging in political dirty tricks?
To give you the same answer, sir.
I mentioned before that Mr. Stone was in direct communication with the creature of Russian GRU, Guccifer 2, and that's something the intelligence assessment talked about, the role of Guccifer 2. Mr. Stone, on August 17th, are you aware, received a communication from Guccifer 2 that said, quote, "I'm pleased to say that you are great. Please tell me if I can help you anyhow. It would be a great pleasure to me." Are you aware of that communication from essentially Russian GRU through Guccifer to Mr. Stone?
I have to give you the same answer.
Are you aware that Mr. Stone also stated publicly that he was in direct communication with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks?
Same answer.
Are you aware that Mr. Stone also claimed that he was in touch with an intermediary of Mr. Assange?
Same answer.
This question I think you can answer. Do you know whether the Russian intelligence services dealt directly with WikiLeaks or whether they too used an intermediary?
We assessed they used some kind of cutout. They didn't deal directly with WikiLeaks, in contrast to DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0.
In early October, are you aware that Mr. Stone tweeted, "I have total confidence that my hero Julian Assange will educate the American people soon"? Are you aware of that tweet?
I'm back to my original same answer.
And are you aware that it was only days later that WikiLeaks released the Podesta emails?
Same answer.
I'm going to yield now to Mr. HIMES.
Thank you, Mr. Shiff. I note that we're going through the 90-minute mark in this hearing, so let me step back a second and just review the topics because there's a lot on the table. I think my friends on the Republican side will get no argument from this side on the importance of investigating, prosecuting leaks. Leaks are a threat to our national security, whether they're perpetrated by Edward Snowden, whether they're perpetrated by people outside the White House, or perhaps, as we have seen in the last 60 days, maybe from people inside the White House. But, Mr. Comey, if I can use your phrase, intense public interest, there is intense public interest in the fact that our new president will attack anyone and everyone. He will attack the cast of Hamilton. He will attack Chuck Schumer. He will attack our allies, Mexico, Australia, Germany. He will attack Nazism and with Nazism. But there's one person and one country which is immune, which is inoculated from any form of presidential attack, no matter what the behavior. No matter if there's a violation of the INF nuclear treaty, no matter if Vladimir Putin kills political opponents, the new president defends, obfuscates, does not attack. And the people around the president, Michael Flynn, Jeff Sessions, Carter Page, Paul Manafort, have an odd connection to Russia, a series of odd connections. We all campaign. I don't think any of our campaign people have connections with a foreign power, much less one that is an adversary of the United States. And further, apart from these weird links, without exception, the individuals I quoted have dissembled or misled, maybe even lied about the nature of those connections until the political pressure has gotten to a point where they have been fired or recused in the case of the Attorney General. So I want to look briefly at one of these individuals. And Director Comey, I understand your constraints, but let me ask a couple of questions regardless. Paul Manafort, who is Roger Stone's business partner and Trump's former campaign manager, I want to ask a few questions about him. First, Director Comey, can you tell me what the Foreign Agents Registration Act is?
Sure, not in an expert way, but it's a statute that requires people who are acting as agents of a non-U.S. government to register with the United States.
Right. So the National Security Division of the Department of Justice writes, this is their manual, the purpose of FARA, as it is known, is to ensure that the U.S. government and the people of the United States are informed of the source of information and the identity of persons attempting to influence U.S. public opinion, policy, and laws," unquote. Would you agree that guarding against foreign espionage or foreign influence measures falls under this heading?
Yes.
In general, is willful violation or failure to register pursuant to this law in some circumstances a crime?
I believe it is. I'm not an expert on FARA, but I believe it is.
And it could lead certainly to counterintelligence concerns, right?
Yes.
Now, Paul Manafort, as reported in the New York Times and other outlets, and his deputy Rick Gates ran a campaign in Washington to lobby government officials and push positive press coverage of pro-Russian Ukrainian officials. Paul Manafort began officially working for former Ukrainian President Yanukovych at least as far back as 2007, according to the Washington Post. The lobbying was only discovered by Ukraine's new National Anti-Corruption Bureau, which found secret ledgers in Kiev indicating almost $13 million in undisclosed cash payments from Ukrainian government coffers to Paul Manafort for lobbying done between 2007 and 2012 for Mr. Yanukovych. Director Comey, did Paul Manafort ever register as a foreign agent under FARA?
That's not something I can comment on.
Whether he registered or not is not something that you can comment on?
No.
Okay. Paul Manafort was, however, Donald Trump's campaign manager in July of 2016, correct?
Mr. HIMES, I really don't want to get into answering questions about any individual U.S. person. So
Okay.
it's obvious from the public record, but I don't want to start down the road of answering questions about somebody.
Okay, well, I think the facts would show that he never did register. But as the ranking member pointed out, it perhaps should come as no surprise that the Republican platform, which was drafted at the Republican convention in July of 2016, underwent a pretty significant change with respect to the American response to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and their aggression in that country. It appears, from our standpoint, that we had perhaps somebody who should have registered under FARA pulling the strings there. There's more, though, and I don't know how much you'll be able to comment on this, but I want to just explore for a second the nature of the Russian government, because oftentimes the question becomes, was there contact with Russian officials? And I want to read you a brief quote from a book on Putin's government. This is by Professor Karen. Coate democratic system being pulled down by history, accidental autocrats, popular inertia, bureaucratic incompetence, or poor Western advice, I conclude that from the beginning, Putin and his circle sought to create an authoritarian regime ruled by a close-knit cabal who used democracy for decoration rather than direction. Mr. Comey, is it fair to say that the line that exists in the United States between government officers and government officials is blurred in Russia, that there may be oligarchs or other individuals who on the surface appear to be private citizens but who have connections to this close-knit cabal, who might be agents of influence or might be doing the Kremlin's bidding in contact with others?
That's fair to say, and one of our counterintelligence missions is to try to understand who are those people and are they acting on behalf of the Russian government, those Russian citizens.
Is it generally true that there is a category of Russian oligarchs that are likely part of this close-knit cabal?
In a general sense.
And if they go way back with Vladimir Putin, do the chances increase that they might be connected with the KGB, as asserted by Professor Dawisha?
The longevity of the association can be a consideration.
And the KGB was the Russian intelligence service under the Soviet Union, right?
Correct.
And the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union.
Correct.
Right. I'll just observe, Rinat Akhmetov, a steel and iron ore magnate or oligarch, is the richest man in Ukraine and a strong Putin ally. He was the one who reportedly recommended Paul Manafort to Yanukovych. Mr. Comey, last set of questions for me. I have a report that appeared in CNN yesterday. The headline is, former Trump campaign chief Paul Manafort wanted for questioning in Ukraine corruption case. And I raise this with you because the story is told of Paul Manafort acting on behalf of Ukraine's former Justice Minister Alexander Lavrinovich, who was the Justice Minister under the previous pro-Russian regime, who, and I'll just read a segment from this story here, who was involved in jailing the former Prime Minister, Tymoshenko, who was the main political rival of the Kremlin-backed President Viktor Yanukovych, whom Manafort advised until he was deposed in 2014. Tymoshenko was released from jail at the same time that Yanukovych was ousted. Many saw her sentencing as politically motivated by the pro-Russian government. In response to the deteriorating international climate, Ukrainian prosecutors say Manafort drafted a public relations strategy that included hiring Skadden Arps, an American law firm, to review the Tymoshenko case and show the conviction had a sound legal basis. The story goes on to talk about the transfer of over $1 million, potentially illegally, from Ukrainian coffers to Skadden Arps. And the reason I bring all this up with you is because the story also says, and it appears to have been confirmed by the Department of Justice, that the current Ukraine regime, hardly a friend of the Russians and very much targeted by the Russians, has made 7 requests to the United States government for assistance under the MLA treaty in securing the assistance of Paul Manafort as part of this anti-corruption case. And in fact, the story says that you were presented personally with a letter asking for that assistance. So my question, Director Comey, is that all true? Have you been asked to provide assistance to the current Ukrainian government with respect to Paul Manafort, and how do you intend to respond to that request?
That's not something I can comment on. I can say generally we have a very strong relationship and cooperation in the criminal and national security areas with our Ukrainian partners, but I can't talk about the particular matter.
The story says that the DOJ confirmed that there have been requests for assistance on this matter. You can't go as far as confirming that, in fact, there have been these requests made?
If they've done that, I would need them to do it again. I can't comment on it.
Okay. Well,
And I yield to Terry Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. My questions this morning really revolve around the resignation of the former National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. Director Comey, much has been made about Russia's historical interference with political elections around the world, meant to cause discord and disunity, especially in Western alliances. Does the FBI generally assume that Russian ambassadors to the United States, like Ambassador Kislyak, are at least overtly collecting intelligence on influential Americans, especially political leaders?
Ms. Sewell, that's not something I can answer in an open setting.
Am I right that in the Russian playbook, that it's in the Russian playbook to use diplomats and business people and Russian intelligence officers, whether declared or not, to collect intelligence on influential Americans for the purpose of affecting U.S. policy?
I can answer as a general matter. Nation states that are adversaries of the United States use traditional intelligence officers, sometimes use intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, use people we call co-optees, maybe private citizens, students, academics, business people. All manner of human beings can be used in an intelligence collection operation, but I'm not going to talk about the particular.
Would someone like Ambassador Kislyak play that type of role for Russia?
I can't say here.
The declassified January Intelligence Community Assessment Report that your agency helped to draft, the report that's entitled Assessing Russian Activities and Intentions in the Recent U.S. Elections, specifically states that, quote, since the Cold War, Russian intelligence efforts related to the United States elections have primarily focused on foreign intelligence collections that could help Russian leaders understand a new U.S. administration's plans and priorities, end quote. So knowing what we know about Russia's efforts and the role of the Russian ambassador, Director Comey, would you be concerned if any one of your agents had a private meeting with the Russian ambassador?
If an FBI agent had a private meeting with a Russian government employee of any kind, it would be concerning, and I assume by private, one that's not disclosed or part of their operational activity.
That's
yes.
right.
Yes.
And would you expect that agent to report that meeting?
Yes.
Admiral Rogers, a similar question. Would you be concerned if one of your intelligence officers had a private meeting with the Russian ambassador? And would you expect that intelligence officer to report that meeting?
Disclosures of interactions with foreign governments is a requirement for all our employees, to include myself, for example.
I ask these questions because on at least 4 occasions that I can count, Mr. Flynn, a 3-star general and a former intelligence officer, someone with influence over the U.S. policy, and someone with knowledge of state secrets, and the incoming national security advisor communicated with and met with the Russian ambassador and failed to disclose it. So I ask you, directors, if you wouldn't stand for your own staff to do this, why should we, the American people, accept Michael Flynn doing it?
Ms. Sewell, I'll let Mike Rogers take it next, but I can't speak to what the disclosure obligations are for other people in the government, so it's hard for me to answer that. I can answer, and I answered, I hope accurately, with respect to one of the FBI's special agents.
And I likewise would answer the same way in terms of the NSA.
Gentleman's time has expired.